start recording. So this session is being recorded from now. And as I mentioned, I'm going to be taking a look for the next 55 minutes or so at socialization. And so let's just get these slides going. So there we have that, socialization. And so to get the ball rolling, there are 6 of you in the room. I'd like each of you to type in your answer in the text to this question. Are you an adult? Let me just see now. So that's interesting and encouraging. How would you respond? Oh, I forgot to do my little spiel about turning on your microphones. I still very much want to encourage you, if you're comfortable, to turn your microphones on to respond to this. And I will try to remember in a few minutes to return to turning on the microphone as a component of, as a way of understanding some of the different approaches sociologists have taken to understanding the process of socialization. So Omer just joined us, and I posted this question on Blackboard here, are you an adult? And I asked everyone to type their answer in, and everyone said yes. How would you respond? What would your private internal response be to someone who typed in, no, I'm not an adult? So someone in our class who said they weren't an adult. What would you think about that?
Hey, Tony.
Yeah.
So if somebody answered no, that they were not an adult, I would assume that they are a 17-year-old kid. I put yes, I am an adult.
Right.
I'm a 28-year-old man and
Right.
a fully grown man.
Yeah.
So that's like the difference that I'm putting between the yes and the no.
Which part? There's a couple of parts in there that you put in.
If somebody said no, that they are not an adult, it's because they're still an adolescent. And yes, I am an adult because of that I'm fully grown. Like I'm looking at the term adult and I see that as like being fully grown, mature. There's a huge difference between the two, like an adult and an adolescent in their role in society, knowing their place. Yeah, like in the
Okay, so
family.
I'm going to push back a tiny little bit. I want to take some of what you said. So um, you're a fully grown man, and that's one component. If I've understood what you're saying, that's one component. Well, probably, I'm not a biologist, or a medical doctor, so I'm not 100% sure about this, but it seems likely to me that at a certain stage you stopped getting taller. I know I did. I'm, let's just say, over 28 years old, and I stopped getting taller at a certain point. But around that point, I had friends who still kept getting taller. So where I'm going with this is I didn't know the minute or the day or the week or the month that I stopped getting taller. Is it possible to be an adult and not know you're an adult? how would that be? How could you possibly be mistaken about this? Okay, Anusha said, I'm gonna have to, sorry, just quickly go back to what Anusha said. Different responsibilities. Um, how can you tell about someone else whether they're an adult or not? So let's shift it a little bit. Rather than asking you if you're an adult, how would you know about someone else that they're an adult? Okay, Omer, I'm not sure here what the pronouns are, because they determine what constitutes an adult. Who's they? Each one of us gets to decide for ourselves whether we're adults. Is that what you mean? Omer, go ahead.
Yes, I think being an adult is an idea, and that all of us, it's like a social contract. All of us agree that these are the requirements. This is what makes you an adult. The first one is the age of 18. Okay, not necessarily your capacity, because some people, they are 18, but their capacity is that of a 10-year-old, for example, but legally they would be an adult because we establish those rules. We say these are the things that make you an adult. Um, but values are part of the things that make you an adult. Responsibilities, and these are all things that we agree make a person an adult.
But in Ontario, for example, uh, 18 is the age at which you can vote. 19 is the age at which you can purchase alcohol. 16 is the age at which you can legally drive a car. And those dates were all those legal uh, borderlines. So those legal definitions, right? 15 years of age, 364 days, you can't drive yet. The next day, legally, you could. 17 years, 364 days, you can't vote yet. The next day, you can. We made decisions. The legal age for voting was, when I was born in 1961, it was 21. And that age was shifted back to 18 years of age. Does that mean, and does it make sense to say that on the day the government passed the law to move it from 21 to 18, then on that day being an adult shifted? So another more general way of distinguishing it, Mario initially offered a kind of a biological explanation or description of adulthood. And then a couple of you shifted to a legal framework for adulthood. And those, it seems to me clear, those don't automatically line up with each other. The biological definition and the legal definition don't automatically match. And that's especially clear when you take a look at the fact that the legal definition itself varies, that you're legally an adult in some respects at a different time than you are legally an adult in some other respects. And so when Omer suggests that we all agree, with respect, I think you're mistaken about that, Omer. I think that it's clear that we don't all agree. I think that it's more complicated even than that. But so what do you think, Omer? How do my examples about the differences in legal adulthood in Ontario, right? So never mind the difference between Ontario and Quebec. In Quebec, you can buy alcohol when you're 18, not 19. In the United States, it varies, and around the world it varies. Does it make sense to say that you're an Ontario adult but not a Quebec adult?
The thing that I agree with you, but the thing that I think we must differentiate is that there is a difference between being mature and being an adult. Biologically, you might be able to say, hey, at this age, a person will be mature. They will have sufficient, I guess, I can't think of it right now, psychological capacity to make certain decisions and things like that. That will make them an adult, but really it's just maturity. And I think adulthood will always remain a legal thing because I think the people in charge of society, making the rules, I think they based on research, they say, hey, people of this age group are not mature enough to do certain things. So therefore, we're gonna raise the age for that particular activity to that number. So I think when they're trying to figure out um, the things that make an adult, I cannot find the words right now. When they're trying to figure out the characteristics of an adult, they consider maturity. And I think maybe that's why we have the different age groups for certain activities.
Well, the one problem with that view is that that's not what happens. Even just narrowly in legal terms, it's not as though when you're 17 you get 2/3 of a vote and there's some sort of slow moving into it. You can't vote at all until you're 18, and then once you're 18 you get to vote. With driving it's a little bit different. The driving regulation matches a little bit better your suggestion in Ontario anyway. When you turn 16 you get a license to drive that is not, it's a graduated licensing scheme that we have in Ontario. So you can't drive by yourself. You need to drive. You need to have with you in the automobile an adult, a driver who's over I think it's over 18, but I'm not even sure about that. Certainly between 16 and 18.
With at least 5 years of experience.
Is that what it is? Yeah.
Yes.
See, it's been a long time since it's been a long time since even my children were in that position. So never mind how long it's been for when I got my license. It was all or nothing. Once you got your license, you were good to go. But so in some respects, adulthood is enacted institutionally in a transitional way that represents that one model. But in other respects, that's not the case at all. So in Canada, for example, and here again, not only am I not a doctor, I'm also not a lawyer, but it's my understanding that you can be charged with a criminal offense, or you automatically will be charged. I mean, if you're arrested and you're over a certain age, you will be charged as an adult. But under certain circumstances, the court, and by that, roughly speaking, society has spoken. I think there are deep problems around the connection between society and the courts, but that's not the topic I want right now. The courts can, under certain circumstances, charge you as an adult. Now, what does that tell us something about adulthood being a process rather than a condition? And so the sociological point I'm trying to make is that adulthood, being an adult, is the result of a process. In many, at least in many respects, being an adult is the result of a process. And so Omer used the term mature. The difficulty with analyzing adulthood as a process in terms of maturity is the sociological difficulty is that it makes value assumptions. It makes a number of value assumptions that are typically exactly what it is that sociologists disagree about. So it's not so much that it's mistaken as that it doesn't name, it doesn't frame the process in a way that allows sociologists to ask the questions they think are most important. So let's compare for a minute some of the different consequences of achieving or not achieving adulthood. With a driver's license, society basically has decided we will let you start driving at 16, but you won't get all of the legal privileges of adulthood until you've successfully demonstrated that you have matured. Let's use Omer's term for now, that you've developed, I think might be a little bit more neutral, that you've developed the skills and aptitudes and required to be a driver with all of the entitlements that adult drivers have. That's not the case with voting. With voting, as soon as you're allowed to vote, you're allowed to vote, and it's nobody else's business. It doesn't even really exactly make sense to ask, how well did you vote? Right? And likewise with obeying or disobeying the law. A 4-year-old it's not even considered possible that a 4-year-old could break the law. A 4-year-old can do things that are harmful, but a 4-year-old will not be held legally responsible for those actions. A 20-year-old will. A 14-year-old, it's a transitional thing. And it's this transition that is the term socialization is intended to illustrate through the term itself that sociologists see becoming a member of society as a process. It unfolds over time, and it unfolds at different rates depending on, in part, the individual who's undergoing this process, but also depending on the different categories that are being used to evaluate the extent to which you have been socialized into this thing. So you become socialized as a driver, you become socialized as a citizen. At work, you become socialized into your work. My understanding is that many of the students who are at Seneca now have jobs, and many of you are young enough that you are either in your first job or at the very least you remember your first job. And there's a number of different ways that you are introduced to the work that you're being asked to do for your job. And I think the early days and the sort of, the transition from being a new person at work to being, in a way, one of the gang is an excellent model for you to try to refer to understand what it is, how it is sociologists understand the process of socialization. Does that make sense? And so if, let's say you work uh, at a place and I'm trying to imagine, let's say you work at Canadian Tire and you've been there for 3 years, and your manager tells you, we hired 2 new people, and one of the new people is me, and one of the new people is someone else in our class. I would be the new guy, even though I'm 61, even though I'm 59 years old, and the other person would be the new person also, even though they're 19 years old or say 17 years old. Now you're very likely going to respond slightly differently to the two of us, but there would be some shared aspects. I don't know when we take our breaks. I don't know where the plumbing department is, this kind of thing. You're going to have to adapt your response to my transition as an employee, and you're going to do that same thing with the other person. Does that seem right also? Yeah, Elias, go ahead.
I just wanted to ask, Professor, how would you define the term underage from a legal and sociological perspective?
Well, the legal, one of the advantages from a sort of a teaching point of view about legal is that most law codes are very disciplined in terms of setting definitions. And so underage, from a legal point of view, is laid out in the legislative framework. And so if you take a look at different pieces of legislation where age is a factor that's pertinent to that legislation, the law sets it out. And in a larger sense, the Constitution will set these terms. And so the legal definition of underage is very generally a very straightforward matter. The law sets at what age this people begin to have certain responsibilities, begin to have certain privileges, and anything below that age is underage. Sociologically, though, it's a very different kind of feature. So just as a tiny example, I don't know how many of you follow hockey. I'm from Montreal originally, and the Montreal hockey team is in the playoffs right now. And they have a bunch of young, from my point of view, young players. And the youngest player on the team is 20, and he had a good game last night. And another player on the team who's only 21 was asked about this other player, and he said, yeah, the kid had a good game. And the commentators, who are much closer to my age, although they're still younger than I am, they pointed out how funny it is to hear a 21-year-old refer to a 20-year-old as a kid. And that indicates how in many situations and in many respects, underage is a relative term. If we go back to my example of if you were a seasoned employee and your manager asked you to train 2 new employees, it wouldn't really make sense in many ways to think of an employee at my age, so a 59-year-old who's beginning to work at Canadian Tire, as underage, the way it might make sense for you to think of a 17-year-old who's beginning to work as underage. So underage will depend a little bit on how relevant age is to the progression through which you're interacting with that person. I just want to switch over to my slides for a second. I hadn't anticipated that excellent question, but there's a term here that I want to dig up. Just if you'll be patient for a second. Resocialization is a relatively recent adaptation and area of research in the sociology of socialization. And resocialization, the quote here is, the slide says, occurs when socializing agents deliberately cause changes. No, that's the wrong. Hang on. Adult socialization. So in the contemporary world, for a number of reasons, and because this is a new phenomenon, sociologists are still scrambling and are still have not yet settled on a uniform vocabulary. But a feature of the contemporary world is, on the early side, our notion of adolescence and adulthood is extending longer and longer. And so the textbook claims that adulthood, that adolescence extends to as late as 30 years of age. In one of the articles that was cited in that StatsCan COVID gendered paper that your assignment is based on, one of the footnotes refers to a slightly larger earlier larger bit of research that StatsCan carried out on not in employment, education, and training. And they referred to a department of, I forget what part of the federal government, but their category for youth is from 18 to 34. When I was 18 years old, 34-year-olds, it would have been impossible to seriously consider a 34-year-old as a youth. And I think many 20-year-olds would still be puzzled by the idea that a 34-year-old could be a youth. But that's changed over time. Does that begin to answer your question, Elias? Okay, so, okay, good. So now, so when does one become an adult? How does one become an adult? And then finally, who decides? And that's the question that I'd like to look at for a minute or two more before we move on to this. Who decides who's an adult and who's not in all of the different ways that I'm saying? So legally, who decides who's an adult? Let's say in Ontario. Well, legally, yes, it's the government for sure. So the provincial and the federal government, within their specific areas of jurisdiction, they get to decide. So in Ontario, I think it was 1978 in Ontario, they changed the legal age for drinking. They moved it from 18 to 19. It had been dropped from 21 to 18, but then for a number of reasons, it was moved from 18 to 19. Now, why do you think, what factors do you think might enter into the government's decision-making process around at what age people can legally buy alcohol and can legally go into bars? one of the concerns is going to be public health. And how is that connected to adulthood, and how is that connected to socialization? Well, another way of looking at it is, if alcohol is bad for you, why not just make it illegal for everybody?
I'm not exactly sure how to word this, but I said public health because um,
That's good. Go ahead.
no, sorry, I thought my mic was off for a second. I chose
Uh,
public health because um, from what I know, the younger you are, the more alcohol kind of affects your body, such as the liver and stuff. So like it doesn't really help it grow mature, I guess.
right. So that's an excellent answer. That there is a different biological consideration. The liver, but also the brain. It's well established that alcohol has a different effect on the brain as it's growing compared to on the brain on a full grown brain. Although recently, uh, neuro, neuroscientists are the scientific understanding of the brain is undergoing dramatic changes, and we know more and more and more about the brain. But it used to be very widely believed, and I think there's still a great deal of evidence that supports this, that the growing brain is more vulnerable to damage than the full-grown brain. And at the very least, from a legislation point of view, that is one of the reasons that there's an age limit on a minimum age for purchasing and consuming alcohol. And so that is partly an explanation for why the government, why society through government would try to restrict alcohol consumption at certain ages. But part of it is that alcohol companies are owned by multinational corporations that are very powerful. Lots of jobs are involved in the making of beer and wine and whiskey and so on. And so there's a money consideration at work here. The government taxes alcohol at a much higher rate than it taxes most other goods that it taxes at all. And so in Ontario, in a certain way, Ontario society is addicted to alcohol tax. And so the budget of Ontario and the budget of Quebec and Nova Scotia and of Canada depends in a certain way, or at least has gotten used to, the money that's derived from the sale of alcohol. Another consideration is, well, if I like a glass of wine, who are you to tell me I can't have a glass of wine? Why don't you just mind your own business? If you think wine's bad for you, even if you're right, then don't drink wine, but leave me alone. Let me drink wine if I feel like it. I don't tell you what music to listen to. I don't tell you what kind of salad dressing to put on your salad. Why should you be allowed to tell me what kind of liquid I can consume? I'm not saying that argument is independent of the claim that, well, when you're drunk, you become a jerk. I'm still not allowed to punch you. You're still not allowed to punch me, whether you're sober or whether you're drunk. So that the fact that alcohol changes behavior, from the narrower perspective, the behavior the behavioral results of consuming alcohol remain constant across the different. So being drunk isn't an excuse. More by and large, more or less, you can't do the things sober or drunk, and that's how we decide what behavior we're going to tolerate and what behavior we're not going to tolerate. And so the decision to put an age on when alcohol can be consumed is driven by multiple factors. Going back now or moving to the article that I've asked you to read for the COVID and sociology theory, this category of NEAT, neither in education, employment, or training, is driven by a number of different considerations. In the article, they describe the problem associated with elevated levels of NEAT, that is, youth who are neither in education, employment, or training, is that it's been observed, so the data shows us that youth who are not in one of those three areas, they tend to find it increasingly difficult to re-enter one of those three things. And the goal for sure is employment. In our modern society overall depends for its survival on employment. So we need as a society for all of the products and services that are produced on which we depend to survive and also to continue living the way we live. We need people doing this work. And the thing about humans is we get older and we die. So we don't just need it for today and for later today and for tomorrow. We need to be able to replace the workers as they age out of their jobs and as they move up through their job, their employment. So we need to be continually replacing employees and workers. And the concern is that we won't be able to do that as efficiently and as well if youth are, for a number of different kinds of reasons, and the reasons are really what sociologists are trying to understand, and the reasons are really what the policymakers are trying to adapt to. Why is it that they aren't in education, employment, education, or training? Because we can see from the data that as youth fall out of that, they're less likely to re-enter into it, and society overall depends on this. And so seeing it as a process, seeing socialization as a process, on the one hand, is just simply a more accurate characterization of what it is. It's not the case in many respects that you go from being an adolescent one day to a youth to an adult the next. It's a transition. And you take it on and you have it imposed on you. Both of those dynamics are in place. What are some of, can anyone think of an example of it being imposed on you, of adulthood being imposed on you? Sorry about that. The power went out here and then my internet faded, but I'm back. Are any of you still there? Let me just get my panel open. Can you hear me? Good. So sorry about that. Now I'm trying to remember where I was. Am I still recording? Yes, I'm still recording. Okay, so the socialization process, right? So the main function, the main feature that sociologists consider is that becoming a member of society is a process and that it's an institutionalized process. Humans coordinate their action in order to, in the expectation of certain kinds of outcomes. And so the most widely shared version of that experience, it's not universal, but it's the most widely shared, is young humans being raised by older humans. And the way that happens in most human societies is through the biological family unit. And so many of us, statistically speaking, anyway, most of us were raised by one or two of our biological parents. And the term, we were introduced to a language, we were introduced to a set of values, to an orientation to the world around us. And through that process, to a great degree, a process that is unconscious. And so many aspects of how it is that adults transmit to their children and how the adult generation transmits to the younger generation remain unreflective. There's still loads and loads that we don't know about what it is we're doing and how we're doing it and why we're doing it. On the other hand, a great deal of effort and attention is devoted to doing just that, to transmitting from one generation, from the older generation to the newer generation, all of the, or many or most of the skills and aptitudes that are necessary for, on the one hand, the individuals from the new generation to lead happy lives, and on the other hand, for the new generation as a whole to be able to replace the older generation as it ages into a new, as it ages and dies, basically. And in the modern world, for a number of reasons, it's a crucial feature of that process that individuals take on and acknowledge their own agency, that is their own acknowledgement of their responsibility to participate in society. And so when I ask, at the beginning of the lecture, I asked, are you an adult? And the first time I ever asked that in class, I didn't ask it in terms of, it wasn't in a sociology class, it was in a political science class. And the reason I asked it was that it was early in my career, and I was having a behavior problem with the class. The class was unruly. I was teaching at another college in a police foundations program, and I lost my temper in class, basically, and I felt that the students weren't paying proper attention or sufficient attention, and I lost my temper. And the next class, I was trying to recover some kind of working relationship with the classroom. And I asked them, I told them that I assume all of you are adults. Do you think of yourselves as adults? How many people here think of yourselves as adults? And many of the students many of the students did not put their hands up when I asked who here thinks of themselves as an adult. And I was flabbergasted. It had never really crossed my mind. I was basically asking it in a rhetorical fashion. Obviously, everyone in there, I thought, obviously, everyone in there thinks of themselves as an adult. But I was mistaken. Many of the students in there did not think of themselves as adults. And it's an important feature. Now, why would that, how, let me turn it over to you for a second. In what ways could that be an important thing? What turns on whether or not you think of yourselves as adults? Well, I'll try to move things forward. Yesterday in Ottawa, the government passed a number of laws. A number of bills went through their final assent. And there's, I think, just one more day for the summer session, for the spring session of Parliament. They're about to enter into the summer recess. And there's a very good chance, at least the newspapers are speculating, and political scientists and so on are speculating, that instead of recalling Parliament in the fall, the Prime Minister might decide to have an election in the fall. I think that's very likely, and I think most people agree that it's the signals are all there that the Prime Minister is going to call an election in the fall. What connection might there be between what it was I was trying to do and the story I just told? What connection is there between whether you see yourselves as adults and a fall election? In our society, one of the rights, and in a more or less absolute way, one of the rights of being an adult citizen in our society is you have the right to vote. Most people agree that along with rights come responsibilities. And so, in addition to having the right to vote, there's a fairly broad consensus that you also have the responsibility to vote. The idea of adulthood being important to society is can be understood as the convergence of, or the overlap between your rights and your responsibilities. What happens, so in the fall, if there's an election, the government is going to be formed on the basis of the people who take up the right and meet that responsibility and go and vote. Now, in the past, the data is very clear. 20-year-olds vote at a much lower rate than 50-year-olds vote. It's also clear that 20-year-olds in 2018 voted at a lower rate than 20-year-olds voted in 1970. Young people the voting rates of young people has declined over time over the last 50 years. And that represents possibly a problem, but it represents an illustration of what it is I'm trying to talk about around adulthood and socialization and processes. So the government is concerned for a number of different competing kinds of reasons about this decline in youth vote. And one of the ways the government responds to this is they invest resources and they try to put into place practices and institutions that would change that. The government claims, I believe them, the government wants young people to vote more, and they want to socialize young people into seeing themselves as voters. Does that make sense to you? Does that seem plausible? Elias, go ahead.
I wanted to ask if you put that in another way to explain, like in another word, like
To explain what?
to explain this issue that you said just.
Okay, so at the very start of the lecture, I asked the question, are you an adult? And in a certain way, that seems like a transparent question. If I ask you, are you wearing a blue t-shirt? You either are wearing a blue t-shirt or you're not wearing a blue t-shirt. That's fairly straightforward. But whether you're an adult or not is more complicated than whether you're wearing a blue t-shirt or not. In Canada, if you're over 18 years of age, let's say, in the past in Canada, under certain circumstances, the government has passed laws where if you're a male, back when this happened, if you're a male citizen over 18 and in good health, you will become a soldier. The government will conscript you into the army. And that is it's independently of whether or not you consider yourself an adult, the government decides we're at war, we need soldiers. So whether you're ready or not, we're going to put you in the army because society has decided you're old enough to do this. So society has a stake in a partial stake in whether or not you're an adult, at least with respect to certain particular specific functions. We decide whether or not you're mature enough to buy alcohol by how many days you've been on our planet. We decide whether or not you can drive we decide you cannot drive a car until you're at least 16 years of age. And then we add other conditions because getting that decision wrong has negative consequences for society in general. With voting, people who fail to see themselves as adults are less likely to take the responsibility that attaches to the right to vote seriously. And what we see, this is at least one description of what's going on. I think there are other things going on. I think that by and large, the government has let me just, does that begin to, maybe Elias, you could explain a little more what it is you're not understanding? I know that's a difficult question, but
Yeah,
maybe you
I understood the point that you made. Thank you very much. And also, if you can mention, like, because you got disconnected, Professor, about the example of imposement of adulthood, the example that you mentioned before, and you ask us to give some example about the imposing adulthood.
Oh, okay. Well, that was the army thing, conscription into the armed forces. So I forget if I've mentioned this or not, but on my father's, I'm a Canadian citizen, but I also have Belgian nationality because when I was born, my father had not yet become a Canadian citizen. He was still actually, no, he was both. He was a Belgian citizen and a Canadian citizen. So I have a Belgian passport. But in order to get my Belgian passport, I had to explain why I had done my military service in Belgium. In Belgium and in a number of other countries, Israel, for example, I don't know. I know that there are many other countries, but I'm not sure which ones they are. But in Belgium and in Israel, once you reach 18 years of age, unless there are some exceptions, but everyone has to serve in the military. And they don't ask you, do you feel like it? They don't ask you, do you think you're up to it? They decide you're an adult, so you're going in the military. So that would be an example of where society imposes on you adulthood. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it was a very good example of imposition of adulthood. Thank you very much.
You're very welcome. Okay, so now I wanted to just get to one more thing. Right. So first, I think it's clear that you can be an adult in some respect, but not in others. Some people will treat you as adults, and other people will not treat you as adults. So at work, your boss, if you're 20 years old and your boss is 30 years old, there's a chance that your boss will take you more seriously than your parents are able to. I'm speaking here, and it's when I see my son, when I see my daughter, it's a very peculiar thing. But in many ways, I still relate to them in ways like they're, in some days anyway, when they're 10 years old. Uh, but when I run into you, it's a different thing. If I ran into you, if I saw you, if we had an in-class relationship the way it had been before COVID, I automatically treat all of you as though you're like all the other students I've had, roughly speaking, like you're adults. Whereas for parents, it's a difficult thing to separate out the adultness of their adult children with the children part of their adult children. And likewise, the people you are friends with now that you've been friends with since you were children, your relationship to them and your connection to them is different from the relationships you build with other people that you've only known as adults. So I think it's clear, and that also is further support for the claim that we're social, that we become the social beings that we are as a result, as a consequence of a process of socialization that is in part conscious, measured, the result of thought through practices on the one hand, but also spontaneous, natural, unreflective, and kind of going on without a particular plan. And so both of those processes, but both of those dynamics are occurring in the process of socialization. Now, Elias, go ahead.
Sorry, I talk a lot, but I have another.
Please don't apologize.
Okay.
I'm thrilled that you're doing this.
Okay, I have another question. It is like my personal experience. I used to go to library when it was not COVID,
Yeah.
and I went in some library they have teenage part. The certain age of people can sit over there, and I was wondering if that is ageism or age discrimination, like if that is age discrimination, because that area particularly is designed for a certain age, and I don't know if it's age discrimination or it's a proper thing from a sociology
Well,
perspective.
those are either or options. In a library, I mean, the local, the library near me, nearest to me, has a children's section and an adult section. And there's a couple of differences. In the children's section, the chairs are all small. So adults couldn't properly really sit in those chairs. The chairs are the size of children, and the books are meant for children and their parents. And what happens is in the children's section, I think to a great degree, the reason to organize a library that way is a functional reason. In the adult section, the purpose of the library is different than the purpose of the library is in the child section. And so the rules are different. There's more talking, there's more noise in the children's section. It's difficult to keep children. Okay, so let me just see this. Well, I don't have it in front of me, but the tricky thing about discrimination, the word discrimination, is ultimately what it means is distinguishing between different categories, different groups, and there are warranted discrimination. There's warranted discrimination and unwarranted discrimination, and so having a children's section in the library, I'm almost certain would survive any challenge to the Ontario Human Rights Tribunal. And having a children's section in the library, I'm fairly sure anyway, is consistent with the purposes of a human rights code. The reason there's a children's section is because children are allowed to do more things in the children's section than adults are allowed to do in the adult section, rather than the other way around. You're allowed to speak a little bit more noise is allowed in the children's section. And so the idea is not so much that adults get more advantages, it's rather that children get more advantages in the children's section. Older libraries, children essentially were not allowed, or if they were there, they had to keep completely quiet. Adding a children's section to the library is meant to make the library more accessible. It's like a tiny bit like adding a wheelchair ramp to a library rather than taking something away. I'm speculating here. I don't know the history of libraries and so on, but that would be my guess, that a children's section in the library is meant to increase the usability of the library for children rather than to discriminate against children. Does that seem plausible to you?
Yes, it was clear. Thank you.
Okay. You're welcome. And I can't wait till we can go back to libraries. I think libraries are fantastic places. But in the meantime, I just want to get this one last slide on. Although socialization as a process operates in many respects on a continuum, and what I mean by that is there's no absolute and arbitrary cutoff point overall in becoming an adult or becoming a citizen or becoming something. It doesn't typically start at an exact point in time. Nonetheless, the result of socialization across a population settles into different sorts of what sociologists now call roles. And the vocabulary was borrowed from theater. And so in a theatrical production, let's say we were producing the play Hamlet, the actors play different roles. So one actor plays Hamlet, another actor would play Polonius, another actor would play Ophelia, and so on. And each of these roles performs a different function in the play. And the play only works when the different actors each play their roles. And so that metaphor was introduced by, or at least was most influentially introduced. I'm not sure he was the first to use this vocabulary, but it was Irving Goffman and the dramaturgical study of society. And so the vocabulary that sociologists, and it's now widely used in everyday language, and it's an important component in how policy operates, but we understand society in many of the different ways that society operates to be organized into particular roles. I have a role as a teacher, and you have a role, each of you has a role as a student. And you can enter into and exit from that role, and I can enter into and exit from my role as a teacher. So at the very beginning of this class, my phone binged and a friend of mine had texted me. And so when my power went out, I quickly checked my phone. I switched from my role as teacher to my role as friend. And it's easier, I think, to understand being a teacher as playing a role, but most sociologists agree that even with relationships like friendship, the notion of role allows us to understand certain aspects of friendship that are generalizable. Does this make sense? Right? Being a teacher, obviously that's a role. I think that's a fairly clear example of a role. But I think that friendship also can be analyzed, at least partly, in terms of roles. Does that make sense? Okay, so I've imposed on your time. I added 15 minutes because we were out. The power was out for a little bit there. Again, I want to I want to thank all of you for your regular attendance to these sessions. I have another section today, and I'm going to discuss. I'm going to start at the same place, but I'm going to do it much quicker. All of which to say, please check your email or check Blackboard later. I'm going to do another lecture and I'll make it available to you to cover another part of chapter 3. And I want to thank you for participating for the first half of the semester. And I look forward to next semester, to seeing all of you next semester. I'm going to be changing how I do this. Among other things, we won't be using Blackboard Ultra Collaborate. And so in the fall, I think we keep being told that in the fall we're going to be online still. I hope that's not the case, but I'm pretty sure it will be. And so I will be doing things a little bit differently, and I hope better. So thanks again, and I hope you enjoy Farzad and the second half of the course. And I look forward to reading your work for the assignment. Have a good rest of the summer, and we will talk soon.
Thank you very much, Professor.
You're welcome.
Thank you for an interesting lecture. Bye.
Bye-bye. So I'm turning off the